Welcome everyone to this webcast where we're diving into the future of consumer industry and the forces that are shaping it. Today, we're fortunate to have Casey Lobal with us. Casey is Deloitte's Global Chief Futurist for the future of consumer industry and has spearheaded Deloitte's research into the Buying into Better framework. So Casey, over 4 years of research, 1,000 professionals that have been participating, over 20 countries that we've covered, and over 250 trends have been identified.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you want to give us an introduction to what the research is about?
I actually think it's important, just as we start talking about the research, just give a little bit more context about my background, because I like to think that this title, the Chief Futurist, I can almost hear the eyes rolling, when we say that. But the reality is that I'm not a researcher by background. I'm not a futurist there's no training that goes with that. I've been with Deloitte for 30 years, and I've been a client service professional. And I've spent that 30 years sort of serving consumer industry clients. So what I try and do is I try and think about all of this work through that lens of our clients, through the actual operations, and what does that mean in terms of competition and that. So I think that's sort of important just to have that framing. But when we took on this effort, like originally it was brought to me and suggested that we do this, and I wasn't so sure that I wanted to do this role to begin with. Originally it was suggested as, we need our top 10 list of predictions. And I was like, no, thank you. I've seen so many bad predictions. The last thing I wanted to do was to do that. Now, as we talked about it a bit more, we decided to take it on, obviously, but we wanted to do it a little differently. Instead of dealing in prophecy or predictions, we just look at the data. It's very data driven. What's really going on? How do you pull the data apart? How do you look at it? And then how does it relate to each other? Like 250 secular trends, technologies, how do they relate to each other? And that's really, we've surfaced the information. That's the lens by which we look at it. And that's what we take out to our clients.
And I then presume that we're not using it as a crystal ball for the future. What's your experience around what kind of impact that the research has had?
Yeah, so it is interesting in that, if you saw the list of the 250 trends, I like to put it up on a slide. First of all, it's just incredibly overwhelming. It's a lot. When you start to look at it, you realize there is the sheer magnitude of things that are changing before us, and I sometimes I refer to it as unprecedented. The sheer amount of unprecedented change is really hard for you to understand until you see it on a page. Now, once you see it on a page, when you read the kind of words of the things we've surfaced, the natural reaction is to say, I think I understand those things. And that was my reaction to was, yeah, I think I understand these things. But what I discovered as we start to dig into them, for example, we all know that the consumer is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. That's not US, that's not European, it's actually a really broad reality that our consumers or that our clients face. But if I said that to you, we would nod our head and go, yep, I know that. But what I discover is that as you pull apart the data and really get beyond talking about averages, there's really interesting nuance in there that our clients are surprised by. And in fact, I was surprised by. And that's a big part of what we're trying to do is sort of break through that assumption that we know what's going on and try and reveal a deeper understanding. And what I find over and over again is that it's highly impactful because, one, I give people permission to say, maybe I don't really know what's going on. Maybe I need to, so I give them permission because I'll say that myself. I'll be very humble that says I thought I knew what was going on. But that sort of ends up being the first impact. The second impact that we discover is really a new way to think about it. The new way to think about it is to not look at singular trends and try and linearly extrapolate them, but rather find the interesting convergence of trends. So it's not, you take one thing and we might say there's an aging consumer. And we might say, okay, first of all, I know that. Second of all, maybe I'll develop a strategy for the aging consumer, a marketing strategy. We say, no, that's not the right way to think about it. What we want to do is say, what happens if this happens, this happens, this happens, and this happens, and those all converge? It actually reveals risks and opportunities that are not visible when you look at one trend at a time and sort of apply them. So that's kind of the big impact, is that aha moment. And then the second big impact is, oh, I need to think about this differently.
And there are 6 forces that we've identified as part of their work. Do you want to give us, elaborate a little bit on which ones those are, and also if you see that some of them are having more impact than others?
Yeah, okay, so we surfaced, the first thing we did is through these interviews, we surfaced, like I said, 250 distinct secular trends, technologies, industry issues, government policies, and then once we had surfaced those, we set about researching those. And so we developed a really robust set of research around this, and that we maintain and we keep it up to date, and that 250 is constantly growing and changing and evolving. But ultimately, we had to find a way to organize those. And what we discovered is they all fall into one of 6 categories. And so that's where we came up with what we call the 6 forces that are shaping. So while they're big macro forces, there's a ton of information that lives underneath them. For example, one of them is the unprecedented consumer, and I've already alluded to that a bit. The changes that are happening with the consumer themselves are happening at a rapid pace, but they're really unprecedented. It's not more of what we've seen. It's actually some really, really different differences that are either upon us or about to be upon us. And by the way, that first category ends up being things that are not choices. They're things you can measure, like a census sort of measurement. And the second category is a changing society and culture. We call it society rewired. And the reason I call out that idea about choices is the second category is about choices. And in our consumer industry, choice refers to priorities. And priorities really refer to, or they really drive, discretionary spending. We spend our money on the things that are important to us, so we have to understand how those change. The third category is really technology, and we call it exponential X-Tech, which sort of fancy words, but really it's sort of 2 things. One is speed. And while we all know that speed has been here with technology, in fact, it's called Moore's Law. We're used to it. It doubles every 18 months. It's actually fairly given that every 18 months the price capacity of computing power is going to double. And that's speed, because doubling and doubling and doubling is actually an exponential curve. That's not actually that surprising, because we've been talking about that for a long time. But what is surprising is that there's a report out from Stanford University on the state of artificial intelligence. And they've identified that AI is not moving at the pace of Moore's Law, it's moving faster. So it's doubling every 3 to 5 months. And when that compounding effect, it's kind of hard to understand and visualize what doubling is. It's hard to get your head around that. But I would tell you, if you were planning a 5-year strategy at the pace of Moore's Law, you have to be prepared for 10x advancement during 5 years. If you're preparing a strategy at the pace of AI's advancement every 3 to 5 months, it's not 10x. It's actually over 1,000,000x. So it really is sort of profound. And of course, we spend a lot of time talking about, how do I understand speed? How do I have to think differently? What are the implications of that? The second component of that X-Tech, that word, really refers to a broader set of technology domains than honestly I traditionally would think about. I would normally think about infotech. So computers and cell phones and databases and data lakes and things like that. But the reality is there's other domains like biotech, synthetic biology, material science, even space as a domain. And not only are those domains also moving at that same pace, they're actually converging, and artificial intelligence is accelerating those domains of technology. So we have to understand those. That's sort of the third. The fourth is really around the industry itself, industry upheaval. So there are a broad set of trends that are occurring that are very specific to how we compete, that are actually redefining the rules of how we compete and dissolving the barriers to entry. And as the barriers to entry dissolve, what we have is a proliferation of competition. We have a proliferation of optionality on behalf of the consumer. And in an environment where there's not a lot of growth, when there's a decline in barriers to entry, there's a fragmentation of share. And that sort of makes you feel like you're in a no-growth environment. So that's sort of industry upheaval. Then we talk about the planet. and climate change. We talk about the impacts that we as an industry and we as a consumer, we produce 60% of all greenhouse gases are produced by our industry or by the consumer themselves. So we have a responsibility. But interesting at the same time, and some of that can be sort of negative, dire trajectories for sure, but conversely, we're also in the midst of the electrification of our economy, which is really a pretty massive switch, a pretty massive investment in infrastructure. Some folks I've heard, somebody I spoke to along the way said, we're going to invest more in infrastructure in a single decade than we have in the entirety of humanity, which is pretty mind-blowing to begin to think about that electrification and what the implications are there. And then finally, the last category of the 6 is government policy, geopolitics, politics, and power. All those topics. And of course, those are hot topics right now, particularly in the US, maybe in Europe as well. Things like immigration, things like the tariffs, things like geopolitical relationships that are shifting. All of those things also impact the future of our industry. And we have to begin to understand how those all converge, where they create risks, where they create opportunities. So there's the 6 forces and the framing around that.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I know that you've had a couple of discussions. We're sitting here in Stockholm and you met several retailers and consumer products companies. Anything when discussing these 6 forces and the trends that we're seeing and how they are converging that stands out for you when it comes to the Nordic market?
Well, one of the things that I find really interesting as I've traveled the world and I've spent a lot of time, particularly in developed markets, is the commonality of the trends. Like we've got different society and culture, but there's so much commonality with the fundamental shifts. Now, some are more amplified in some places. So for example, in the US, I say a lot, we're getting ready to cross a threshold where we'll have more people over 65 than under 18. And in Europe, you've already crossed that threshold. Of course, Japan has already crossed that threshold. We talk about declining birth rate. So in the US now we have a negative, like our birth rate is below the replacement rate. So what that means is without immigration, we're not growing. Our population isn't growing, our workforce isn't growing. That's actually true in Europe as well. It's actually true also in China. It's actually true that the vast majority of industries, or the vast majority of countries, have a birth rate below the replacement rate. Which is really a fundamental topic that we actually have to deal with, is because our industry was built for more. And never, this is unprecedented. There's never been a period of time over the last 300 years as our industry's really sort of taken shape where we really haven't had more people and more consumers and more GDP and more consumer spending, but the fundamental underpinnings of that are starting to change. But that's actually really common if you begin to look at it across. It's a little different, but generally speaking, it's the same. So I think that's probably one of my biggest aha moments, is the degree to which these trends, these forces are playing themselves out, or really have sort of this common theme that plays out. Because I think sometimes we think of our geographies being more different than they are, more advanced, more behind, more, but the reality is the forces are actually pretty common and similar.
Are there specific dynamics that you see like around the Nordic market in terms of everything kind of from the size of the market to the demographics to technology and how that's advancing here that stands out compared to the contrast of the US being a different type of market? Can we see that some of the trends that you've identified will be at an accelerated pace in the Nordics compared to?
Of course, I'm not an expert in the Nordics, so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in the Nordics. But as you begin to look at, like, there's difference in scale. So some of the companies that exist, and certainly there's mega companies that exist in Europe and in the Nordics. But when we start to talk about investment of technology, advancement, the speed of pace, the change, the impacts of artificial intelligence, there's a scale question that comes into the investment. How much can I invest? What's the return on investment that I can derive from my size of market? Can I invest at the same pace as others are investing? And that's actually a really interesting question to sort of crack open, because with the pace of change, there's not only a question of, can I invest that amount? There's also a question of, can I keep up? And that question of can I keep up is actually a big topic that I have with the CEOs that I get a chance to talk to, because it actually implies that we have to think differently about how we deploy capital. So while, yeah, it looks like there's a scale question here, there's actually a much bigger how do I deploy capital question, because what's happening is as the technology advances, our traditional model where we invest capital and our IT team builds something and then we run it for a long time is actually really under threat. But it causes us to have to think differently. We have to move from building to orchestrating. And I think that's true here as well, is we have to begin to think about how do I subscribe to capability instead of how do I build capability. And the deeper you get into the technology, the deeper you understand how good it is on the cutting edge. The more you understand about how fast it's actually moving, the more this reality becomes clear that says I have to think very differently about my traditional approach to even forming and shaping my business and my capabilities. So I think that becomes pronounced, particularly if you don't have the scale to invest at the same rate, whereas some of the companies that that are in the United States or in other geos, certainly do have more scale.
And it's interesting with keeping up and just by identifying 250 trends and what it means to be able to keep up in terms of how those are developing. When you're having conversations with clients and from your experience, are you seeing some commonalities in blind spots? Do you believe that having?
Yeah, it's interesting. Somebody asked me yesterday, they asked a great question that said, when you go talk to executives, they asked, where's their hubris? Which is actually an opposite question that you just asked. But as we spend time with the C-suite, it becomes very apparent, like I mentioned, that said, I thought I understood what was going on. I actually don't find the hubris in this, particularly with the CEO, the CEOs that I speak with. I'm discovering that they are hungry because they know, they sense what all is changing. They also recognize that maybe they don't fully understand it. We all live in a bubble to some extent. The executives themselves, they live in a bubble to some extent. And it's important for them to see or hear or understand information that maybe is outside of that. The other thing that we do is when we talk about artificial intelligence, and I've had this conversation so many times, that the feedback that we get is that we don't try and talk about it as a technology, we try and talk about it as through the lens of business. And the lens of business says we have to talk about economics. Because what AI really is, it's a unprecedented change in the economics of how we run business. And if you can think about it through that lens, and this is part of what I get from the conversations we have, is like, that's a fresh and new and different perspective. Because when the marginal cost of executing business plummets, it actually opens up all sorts of opportunities to not just become more efficient, but actually think differently, to unlock new opportunities that maybe weren't even possible before. So I guess that's my long way of answering this question around, like, when we have these conversations, what sort of reaction do we get out of that?
Do you see any commonalities in what they then see that they would act upon after these conversations? And maybe also, like, what are your, not recommendations, because it obviously depends on what type of company it is and what the challenges are. But there you would say come across in terms of the insights and...
Well, we've not only done the work where we've surfaced the 250 trends, we actually then derive out of those a set of implications. And I'll talk about some of those implications in a second. But we also then take this down to what we call the subsectors. So I've taken this and I've worked with our restaurant practice. And in the US, we've got a big restaurant practice that works with many of the quick service and fast casual restaurants. And we've developed the future of restaurants. I've worked with with our leaders in our CPG practice, and we've developed the future of CPG. So we actually do have the derivatives, if you will, of the implications and how do I have to think about this in terms of competing going forward. Of course, that's a ton of content because we've done that across 10 different subsectors, and we actively engaging that with clients. But we do discover there are a set of implications that are common across all of the subsectors. Once you do that work and you realize, oh, this same theme starts to show up. And I'll give you just a couple of those. One of those is what we call a shift from mass to micro. And this idea about shifting the mass to micro, it's really based on the fact that our industry was built for mass production, mass distribution, mass marketing. But when you look at the consumer that we were built for, there's this dramatic fragmentation. And that fragmentation and that competition for that consumer is certainly racial and ethnic, economic, it's geographic, it is a lot of different ways. More people living alone, pet owners. And as you begin to look at that data, you realize there's so many things that are diverging and fragmenting out. In order to compete for that consumer, I actually have to prepare to compete, in very, very different ways across that set of consumers. That's the shift from mass to micro. The problem, though, is our clients and most consumer companies were not built to do that. So it's one thing to think about marketing, but it's another thing to think about the rest of your operations. For example, in retail, what we discover is hyper-localized assortment is dramatically more powerful and it drives sales. But most retailers weren't built for every store to have a unique assortment. In fact, it's nearly impossible for the merchant to plan that level of granularity. Now, it just so happens, though, that as artificial intelligence is coming online, you can plan at that level of granularity. I just can't do it the old way. So that becomes more transformative in nature. But that's the shift that all companies are going through. And in CPG, you can see it that says, I used to have 4 big products, but now I actually have to run 30 products. My portfolio is dramatically more complex, and I have to get much more precision about what products are going to go where and how do I market and who do I market to. That's the shift from mass to micro. So that's sort of one. The second, and it's related, is a shift from being insights-led to becoming predictive. And so we've written a paper on this implication, this idea that says most organizations, they've collected data, they've got an insights organization where humans stare at data trying to find interesting stuff. But the real new big unlock is no. We're going to let computing power discover predictive signals. We're going to stop looking at data from yesterday trying to figure out what happened, and we're going to start trying to identify predictive signals that tell us what's about to happen. So that sort of gives us this big shift that's occurring there, and clearly that's related to the first one as well. Beyond that, we've got about 5 or 6 additional big macro implications, obviously too much for us to go in, but I thought I'd share a couple here that are derivatives, that sort of derive from the work that we've done.
Thank you. And are there signals that have been amplified this last time they were done after 4 years compared to the first year of when the research was conducted?
Yeah, for sure. As you look at, it's kind of interesting. I was in Dusseldorf earlier this week, and I shared a slide that had all the trends the first time we presented and now, and first of all, it's just really grown. Second of all, some of the things have really changed pretty significantly. Obviously, 4 years ago, government policy, we had a different administration in the United States, and there was pursuit of different policies. There's things that have changed there. 4 years ago, I was introducing artificial intelligence. I remember one of my own practice leaders said to me, "That's great, Casey, but that's 10 years in the future." The reality is it was about 18 months in the future, and it just wasn't an understanding of that. So that whole topic really has changed, and I spend so much time dealing with misconceptions or conventional wisdom that was built up on earlier versions of the technology, things like hallucinations. I love the hallucinations topic. I'll talk about that just for a second, because the leading models, the hallucination rate is less than 1%. Do you know how error-prone humans are? They actually make mistakes between 15 and 40%. 15% of medical diagnoses are actually incorrect. And so you have to kind of get beyond the conventional wisdom and recognize, in fact, we just had a new AI model that came out, I think it was from Google this week, and it once again pushed the benchmarks much further. So you sort of have to understand how fast it's moving and stay on top of that, and that's different. We've also, from our own internal capability, when we first did this work 4 years ago, there were a team where we did a bunch of interviews, we surfaced the topic, and then I had 5 or 6 people. We set about doing research. And how did we do that? We sat at desktops and we Googled and we searched and we started reading reports and we put this together. We don't do that anymore. We've now completely automated our own work using artificial intelligence. And so we're able to scour for the forces, like how are those changing, what are we missing, what's new, and we're also able to produce and refresh the research using artificial intelligence. And for us, it went from a multi-month effort to in 2 days we can have completely refreshed research. So that's changed for us as well.
Super interesting, and I mean, we've already concluded that it's not a crystal ball, but as a final question, if you would look ahead 4 years and the signals that will be amplified then compared to today, anything that you think stands out?
Yeah, well, let me take it from a slightly different angle.
Yeah.
I think right now, of course, I've already talked about artificial intelligence. There's a lot of conversation about this, but I think that most people are thinking about it as an efficiency gain. Okay? And I think about this one a lot because I actually have a very different perspective around what the impact will ultimately be. There's something called Jevons paradox, which is an economic paradox that says when we become more efficient, we don't use less, we use more. So for example, fuel has gotten dramatically more efficient. We actually use more fuel today than we did when it was inefficient. So what I like to think about isn't, hey, we're going to do exactly the same but cheaper. You know, I like this analogy. If drug discovery became dramatically cheaper, would we just discover the same amount of drugs but just cheaper? No. We're going to discover dramatically more drugs. That's Jevons paradox. What that means is, I like to say, we're getting ready to blow the top off this thing. If you think about this right, this isn't, fearful of jobs. This is unleashed productivity. What are we going to do with that? And so I try and get companies that we spend time talking to sort of think through a different lens. How would I build a business that will capitalize on this? What do I have to change? How do I think differently about this? Because frankly, if we're able to do that, the economic growth doesn't come from population growth. The economic growth comes through productivity growth. And so for me, that's a very positive way to think about it. And historically, it would tell us that's the right way to think about it.
Thank you so much, Casey. On a final note, any last thought-provoking recommendations that you want to give to the Nordic companies in terms of future consumer?
I just like to end on this note because I can spend time, we spend hours talking about what the data really tells us. And it's easy to look at it and to take a view like this is dystopia. Yeah, like some of the information can be very heavy about what's changing around us. Other people, by the way, will hear the same exact information and they'll say, this is amazing. This is utopia. Economic breakthrough, longevity, new drug discovery, all of those things are incredibly positive. And what I like to say is that I don't try and predict which one of those futures we're going to land on. I know which future I want to land on. I know which future I'm investing towards. But ultimately, the difference will be choices. It'll just be choices. Choices that you and I make as parents, as coworkers, as executives, as voters, they'll just be choices that we make. And so what I want people to feel is empowered, first of all, to understand what all's changing, but second of all is to feel empowered around their own role in making those choices to ensure that we don't predict the future, we create the future that we want. So that's how I'd leave the conversation if I could.
And we'll leave on that note. Thank you so much, Casey. And thank you everyone for joining the webinar.